Good morning and welcome to our next installment of Axiom. My name is Albert Jansen van Vieren and I'm coming to you live from our offices in Johannesburg for the first time in lockdown. If you're in South Africa, it's been 61 days of lockdown now. You can probably see that by the length of my hair, not being able to cut it. As one of my friends say, for the first time in a long time, we've got an excuse to go back to our varsity hairstyle days. It is a cold day in Johannesburg for those of you dialing in from all over the world. That's why today I've got coffee with me for this Axiom session. I hope you guys are safe. I hope you are warm and you've got some coffee for today's session. Today's session, we've got Andries, Brink, our CEO, who's going to join us, and Stefan, Cronje, and they're going to talk around the trust currency, a session or topic that is very applicable for today's day and age. The session itself is going to be about 45 minutes, and we're going to leave enough time at the end for questions and answers. So you would see in the bottom of your screen in the middle, there's a little Q&A button. During the session, at any time, you can submit questions using that functionality. We are not going to answer the questions live, but I do encourage you to send through your questions as the session goes along. And then right at the end, we're going to open up for some Q&A where Andries and Stefan would be answering your questions. We would also be making use of the polling functionality in the sessions. And what's great about this is it just allows us to engage with you as an audience. Just got a bit of an icebreaker question here for you, just so that Andries and Stefan can just get to know their audience. So in what industry are you finding yourself operational and where do you work? I'm seeing a lot of answers coming through. It's great. And at this point, I'm going to now introduce you to our speakers. Andries, Stefan, welcome to Axiom.
Thank you very much, Albert. Pleasure to be here. First one that I've joined, and it's a good initiative. Nice to be online, and it's nice to be talking to a whole bunch of people. I see we've got quite a few people logged into this chat, so looking forward to exploring it. Stefan, how do you feel? You're not in Joburg.
I'm not in Joburg. I don't know if I should say this, but I'm staring at the ocean at the moment. So don't be envious, just enjoy it with me. Pretend you're sitting next to me and also having that view. But yeah, I feel very privileged to join you today. Look forward to the session.
It's at this point where I always warn our viewers or people that Stefan is in a home where there are children. We're in the office, but he's in a home with his children. So like all of us during this lockdown, being at home, you've been on that conference call where there's a child who walks in. So if that happens, we apologize for that upfront, but hey, we're all in the same position. So Stefan, don't worry if it happens. It happened to me before multiple times. I'm going to share the results quickly with you guys, and you can see just gives you a bit of insight into your audience. Quite a lot of people dialing in is working in the fintech industry, which is interesting. A lot of IT people. It's going to be an interesting session. What do you think about that, Andries?
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm just looking at the numbers. It's a quite a spread, so that'll be interesting. No one from media, so that's good. But yeah, no, it's a good spread, and I think it'll be a crowd that would like this discussion because quite an analytical crowd.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to hand over to the two of you. You can take us through a session. Just a reminder, please, guys, submit some questions using the Q&A. As we go along. But Andries, Stefan, over to you guys.
Thank you.
Right,
Albert.
thank you, Albert. I think to get us going, we want to hear from you how has lockdown and the impact of COVID impacted your attitude towards change, and specifically your level of mastery when it comes to change. So I'd love to hear from you. Just another poll. And you should be seeing it come up now. All right, so are you, as a result of COVID, as a result of lockdown, a change master, a change manager, a change optimist, a survivor, or even more averse than perhaps you were before? Love to hear from you. Give you a few seconds to respond. Okay, we see two neck on neck sort of change levels here. We have about 35 of 60 people responded. Perhaps just another 10 seconds.
This is very interesting.
Yeah. I appreciate the honesty as well of some people. Another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Okay. So we see that most are calling themselves change managers at this stage, leveraging the opportunity for change to optimize further growth and development in career and perhaps in non-work related areas as well, which is great. Flanked by a change master and change optimist. One person saying, this is really tough. And under the illusion that we will go back to the way things were before. What do you think? What's interesting for you about these results, Andries?
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, if you look at it, we're looking at 60% of people are either change masters or managers, and 85% being optimistic about change. In other words, using this opportunity. And this tells you that people are resilient. People change, people adapt. It may take a while, and we're all going through, I know, the blues from time to time, struggles to get out of bed and just dealing with whatever all of this is, because none of us really know. But on the whole, we're looking at 85% positive response on this. Very interesting. So if I should continue then, I guess, Stefan, and I just maybe want to talk to the audience. When we started looking at this, we thought, what are we going to talk about? and just today, just to prepare you, today is a thought session. It's just it's almost like a campsite, little fireside discussion. There's nothing fancy. There's no real content. We're just going to have it flow. We're going to open it up to discussions. We've of course got a couple of things that we want to sort of share with you, which we think is interesting. And but to contextualize the discussion, I think that I have no doubt about it, that our lives are going to be set in a pre-COVID and a post-COVID phase for the rest of our time. And I think that, I've got children growing up, they're all high school, sort of teenage years, and I think they're going to remember these times certainly as formative in many ways. And there's a number of reasons for that. And we want to get into that and then sort of have a couple of thoughts about it. And the number of reasons is we're looking at so many different aspects coming together at this point in time. We've had, for the past number of years, we've had, technological change that has just been absolutely unheard of. We've never seen the rate of change due to the technological tsunami hitting our planet, in full force. Just think about it. Many of you logged in through your mobile devices, and we used to call these things mobile phones not so long ago. But there's no point, because it's not a phone anymore. It's a device, right? It can also make a phone call, and these days not very well. We all prefer to make voice over IP calls because the quality is just so much better at the moment. But the point is that Apple only released the iPhone, which really set the trend in terms of mobile devices 11 years ago. And today we cannot live without these things. And the point is quite simple, that the rate of change in all aspects have just increased dramatically. And what's very interesting, and I think many of you are in fintech, of course, is that today with this absolute power that we have at our disposal in the form of, you've got more power in your pocket at the moment than what they used to have in a basement in a server room, at a major bank 15 years ago. That's a fact. That's just a scientific fact. But we've got access to all this power. What's happening at the moment, we're able to interact, to express our thoughts, with all this power at the moment like never before. Things like natural languages, things like machine learning, which we can express ways of learning learn from that and then apply that to numerous situations. That's getting very exciting. You know, Internet of Things, obviously there's a lot of devices, everything is measured at the moment, and we can control this flow of information. And so this technological burst is part of COVID in a sense, because COVID is accentuating that. But I was fortunate enough to, about a week ago, be on a call where Stefan hosted a number of very senior business people, and Stefan, what came out of that was that there's also massive change in human behavior at the moment because of all. So, what was your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, while I think what you're saying is so true, and it's in many ways very exciting, and I think some people also experience a certain level of anxiety around it because they don't understand all those changes. And I think what's interesting, what's happening at the same time is also shifts in the way that we interact with each other as humans, in terms of social interaction. And I saw a clip last night it was posted on LinkedIn, where Anderson Cooper interviewed Scott Galloway and his predictions on the impact of COVID on higher education. And one of the things he said is that this whole pandemic situation is not so much a change agent as it is a change accelerator. So there were already certain trends in place before all of this happened, but what COVID and lockdown and all of that has done, it's just exponentially accelerated a lot of the trends that were already at play. And I think from a social interaction point of view, there are three things that I think are worth calling out. The one is a generational shift. The other is an organizational shift. And the other one is perhaps a bit more of a personal shift. And if you think about the generational shift, we see more and more of millennials and now also Gen Z employees coming into the workplace. And we know what sort of characteristic of that group of people is a search for meaning and a search for significance as it relates to work. No longer are we happy to work from 8 to 5 and be productive and get a salary and live our lives on weekends and on holidays. We want to know that what we're doing from 8 to 5 is meaningful and makes an impact. Along with that is a huge need and a desire for feedback, right? And as millennials and Gen Z employees, we often say feedback, but sometimes what we mean is recognition. We want to hear the positive feedback, but sometimes there's also some developmental feedback that needs to be given. But maybe that's also impacted by the fact that when we get into an Uber, we give feedback when we get out. When we've stayed at an Airbnb residence, we give feedback immediately, and we feel empowered by doing that. But we also wonder, how are we being experienced? And so that's a little bit of the generational shift, I think. If you think about the organizational shift, there's that's also something that's not new. It's been happening for a while. It's just been accelerated, is the shift from hierarchies to pockets of power and autonomy across organizations. From sort of very hard command and control, an efficient execution system that's run from the top down, to a more empowered recognition. And this is also one of the things that came up from last week's conversation, is that especially now when we need people to respond, some leaders are actually taking back control, but the best leaders are actually recognizing that there are other people that are closer to the key points of impact, and we need to empower them to be creative in those moments so we respond effectively to everything that's happening. And on that, we worked, the big software company SAP had this, multinational German company, already a few years old, had to transform from a traditional operating model to being truly a cloud company. And that was a significant transformation for them. They chose VTS, the company that I work for, to be their leadership transformation partners. And we asked the CEO of SAP, or SAP, depending on how you call them, what would make you go that this leadership transformation that's linked to your greater organizational transformation would be a success? And he said, if trust increases, then this would have been a success. And we just thought that was so powerful, and we actually started to measure trust at every level. And team members gave a trust NPS score to their managers. You know, how likely are you to recommend your manager as someone you trust? And if they didn't achieve a certain threshold, they were put on performance management and eventually exited. I nearly said executed. Not quite that bad, but they were sort of exited out of the company. And so the second one is this organizational shift. And the third one, I think, is, you know, as it relates to human relationships and social interaction, is a bit more of a personal shift, and what I call the rise in popularity of vulnerability and authenticity. People are hungry for vulnerability and authenticity in relationship, and not just in personal relationships, but also in relationships at work. Again, on the call we joined last week, you know, a moment that I'll remember for a while is where the CEO of a major financial services institution just said, I woke up this morning and I was really tired. I struggled to get out of bed, and I'm worried about burnout for myself, but also for the people around me. And the fact that he was willing to be human and allow himself to be seen was just such an attractive quality. And I think people are hungry for that. You know, gone are the days where you have this superhero that pretends to have all the answers and he's just marching on. But we want people that we can relate to as human beings. And I think that's a bit of a personal shift as well.
Yeah. I'm reminded, you started off the change in human behavior that we are seeing due to COVID by saying that people want feedback, you know, and there's the search for meaning essentially, and so you want to almost measure your meaning through the feedback that you're receiving. But I'm sure you've read it, but the Viktor Frankl classic, you know, Man's Search for Meaning, that he wrote in the Nazi camps. The one thing that of course stood out from people that didn't lose their lives, that sort of could push through, and I mean that's obviously a form of lockdown. I mean that's a total form of lockdown, of course, to be stuck in a concentration camp for years, not 6 weeks. But the ultimate measure for him in terms of people making it was, of course, people not losing hope. You know, sort of having a greater reality, having something firmer to believe in. And it was interesting that of our pollsters just now on our audience, we had 85% people that were still hopeful. So that bodes well for our industry, and that bodes well for things we can't lose hope at this time. But I think that, you know, just sort of also locking onto what you're saying is that this sort of personality, this sort of, let's say, archetype of the perfect CEO, of the perfect leader, someone who's in control at all times, who has all the information, and, you know, he or she is always perfect. I think that's just gone, isn't it? And it makes us a lot more real, and I think it makes business a lot more interesting. And also, I think it opens up, I would say, entrepreneurial thought a lot more, because people can think that I can be that person, you know, I can relate to that. You know, he's also just human. Do you think that sort of this may break a few molds in terms of, and get people to believe a bit better?
I think so, Andries, because I think people know that you know, that picture that certain leaders try to portray of I have all the answers all the time, I'm an expert in every field, I never feel pain. I think people know that doesn't exist. So I think when you try to portray that image, it just makes you really hard to relate to, you know. And you know, another question that was asked on this call last week was, you know, by the managing partner of a major professional services firm, was just, you know, on the one side, as a leader, I want to provide a sense of direction and comfort, but on the other side, I want to be authentic sometimes in just saying, I don't know what the world is going to look like in 3 months' time, and I'm not sure how to plan for that. What do you think? And I think asking that question, what do you think, is incredibly powerful and empowering. And I think people want to be part of something. And when you ask that question, that acknowledges that there is intelligence that sits in every part of the organization, and not just at the very top, the very most senior space. And another comment someone raised was just the power of saying, like, I trust you to deal with this. you know. But obviously there needs to be there needs to have been a track record in order for them to have the confidence to say that. You know, you need to be trustworthy in order to also hear the words. So it goes both ways.
I think the interesting thing here is that we are all aligned around a disease that could take your life. You know, and when you start to number your days, and when you sort of think that, you know, my life is finite, it is not infinite, you know, it will stop, then we become a lot more real. And I think there's a big aspect of this that is driving that shift. You know, so we don't just tend to value ourselves, or we number our own days, which I think is a very wise thing to do. But we also obviously give heed to the fact that someone else's life is as important, you know, and we normally say that, but now it's real. Now we are taking action to make sure that it happens. And I think that sort of softens our interface, you know, it changes our behavior. And that's a very positive thing, I would say. But the other thing, which is maybe a little harder at the moment, a bit of a harder blow, is the fact that, and I don't think people, I think we in the financial services and certainly the fintechs are aware of it, but there's another massive shift happening at the moment. You know, so we definitely have a technological shift. We definitely have a shift in human behavior. But I think the third shift, which we've not seen the full effect of, we had a sort of a sniff of this in 2008, when government started intervening heavily in the financial fabric. You know, by buying up bonds, and, you know, terms like quantitative easing and so on was used. But now it's just on a different scale, you know, and this, I think, is going to be structurally very disruptive to economies, to the way people interact, to the way in which credit is extended, to the way in which value is calculated. And so what we are seeing is, I think, the Western world, which sort of a loose grouping would be the US, England, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, have already printed 7.6 trillion euro to deal with the economic fallout. And I say printed, I use that term loosely, but what I mean is that this is some form of government package / buyback / easing, just to get credit extension into the economy.
Wow.
And I think that is, well, firstly, it's just the mind boggles. The amount of zeros, I don't normally count that far. And so how do you handle that? And here's the interesting thing is, and this is why we sort of speaking about trust, because when you are extending credit, which is what's happening, you know, governments centrally are deciding to extend credit into a system, but is the system credit worthy? In other words, is the system trustworthy? And if it proves to be not, which invariably it will, else the market would have asked for that amount of credit. It wouldn't have been a push. It would have been an equilibrium that would have been reached. But now we're pushing credit down in order to save the day, as it were. You know, and I think this is going to be problematic because things has to break. There is, in fact, no collateral to warrant the extension of this credit. Simply speaking, businesses shouldn't be given this amount of trust through central mechanisms. And that's the problem with central mechanisms, is they have blunt tools. They only have, you know, certain things that they can do, certain levers that they can pull. And in this case, they've now decided to, through the central bank, just push cash. And I think that this, I'm convinced that this is going to be problematic. And why? Because we now have activity that is, as I mentioned, creditworthiness is going to suffer. And you can see that because already you're looking at negative interest rates, which means that I'm not sure that I trust you to actually pay back, an improvement on what I've given you. So the market is demanding that this amount of money is handed out at zero interests. Now I understand the economic theory, but that's essentially what we're saying. We're saying, we don't trust you to actually give us a return on this money, but we know we just have to flood the market with it anyway. Right? From a centrist perspective. And so today's discussion is around, well, so what is organic trust then? What's the difference between this sort of institutionalized trust, which is due to a change that is happening, versus what real trust is? And I don't know, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, how, if we had to put a definition to this, just this word, and why is it important? Why is trust important?
Yeah.
What is it, and why is it important?
Yeah.
I'll ask you the difficult question.
Yeah, sure. That is a good question. So I'm just gonna do the brave thing and just push it out to the listeners on the webinar, and let them answer it for us. So before we give you, their trust is powerful, and it's everything. I think we all buy into that idea, and there's certain universal principles related to trust. There's obviously different models and different ways of defining it. We'll define it specifically for what we want to share during this session. But before we do, we want to hear from you. In your opinion, what is the most important building block of trust? And maybe you feel like all these options are relevant. But if you had to choose one, if you had to lead with one that you feel would be the biggest factor in building trust, which one do you think it would be? So it should be displaying now. You see the first one there? Yeah, I'm not going to read it to you. I'll let you do that.
Those are big words.
Big words. You're welcome to. We'll give you enough time to Google the definitions. Benevolence, I guess, is not a word that's used often these days, but it essentially speaks to good intentions. So you have positive intent. All right, we have a clear winner here.
Yeah.
Which I think Andries will be quite pleased with that result. All right, but half of people responded. Perhaps just another 10 seconds or so. We'd love to hear from as many people as possible. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just your gut response. Okay, and 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Okay.
I think it's interesting. I mean, there's no real wrong answers, is there? These are all building blocks. But it's interesting to see where our audience have left to. And the one I like the most, Stefan, is there's just one person that said that trust is the test of time. And I'm reminded of a big asset manager in Cape Town who says that, trust is earned. So yeah. Implying it's sort of built up over time. And I completely disagree with it. I think you can trust someone in 5 seconds.
Oh, tell us more about that. How would you? That's an interesting thought.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think that when you define what trust is, someone can be trustworthy in a very short space of time. And I think that it was Malcolm Gladwell who said that in his book Blink he mentioned that we as humans are so perceptive. We have so many different ways of actually looking at a scenario, any scenario. You walk into a room, chances are who the good guys are within 5 seconds. He says 3 seconds, I think it was. And the reason for that is we have so many senses that we are actually unaware of. I think that a lot of people would say your sixth sense and all of that, but it's not really that. It's your eyes. It's everything about someone that speaks to that. And frankly, trust, I believe, is something where you can objectively have a look at a set of values, and once someone hits that criteria, you should trust that person. Now, obviously, that is confirmed over time, and that's a good thing. So the trust may deepen, but you can be in a position where you can trust someone very, very quickly. That's my view. And I think the point here is that in business, often you have to, right? You have to make those calls very quickly and know this is going to be a good one. And trust, of course, extends to organizations, extends to teams, and extends to people individually. So again, your set of criteria in which you measure will differ based on the entity that you are measuring. But I'm not going to let you off the hook. You need to tell me what is the definition.
I love what you're sharing, and for me, I'm just gonna just let the suspense build even a little bit more. But I think what I love about you saying, I think trust is built in moments, and maybe certain moments matter disproportionately to others. An initial impression is a powerful, that sort of sets where the trust bar starts, and then it might go up or down over time. But trust is built in moments, and it's important to be able to recognize those moments. The highest response to that question actually was transparency and accountability, which I guess is great news for Andile, because if we're thinking about how distributed ledger technology enables exchange and financial transactions between institutions, isn't that a core foundation that technology is built on? To achieve a greater sense of transparency and accountability. But okay, more about that later. I think you'll give us a sense about the actual tech that sits below that.
Yeah.
I think it was Franklin Covey that says trust is two things. It's made up of competence and character, right? And a lot of the options we put in the poll relates to one of those two things. And competence is an interesting one. I think about it in the sense that competence has to do with what you do, whereas character has to do with who you are as a person, right? So kind of your contribution versus your identity or the values that you represent. And if you think about competence, for my immediate association with that word is almost something static. It's like, I was an audit trainee at one of these big four professional services firms, and we had this list of competencies, that you had to tick off during your 3-year traineeship. And if you ticked all of them off, then you became a qualified chartered accountant, etc., etc. But if I think about that list of competencies, or any list of competencies, and then something like COVID happens, then you realize that competence is so much more than being able to tick off a competency on a predetermined list. It's about quality of work. It's about consistent quality of work. It's about a proven skill. It's about expertise in a certain field. But it's also about when you're placed in uncharted waters, can you be creative and dig your way out? When the context is unfamiliar and you need to compete, like, how good are you at actually creating that competitive advantage? And maybe that's a big strategic word, but that looks like something if you're an individual working on a team. And I think when it comes to trust, I think something that's so important in trust is expectation. And expectation is determined by how your role or how your relationship is defined. So when I say I trust my gardener, and when I say I trust my wife, I mean two very different things, right? And so similarly at work, you could trust someone that they'll do a specific task, they'll execute it well, but can you trust someone to take initiative, to take ownership, to be creative, to go the extra mile, right? And that will also determine like the level of partnership in that working relationship. But so I think that those are some quick thoughts around competence. But I'd love to hear a little bit more from you around the character side of that equation.
Yeah, I think the point that we're making is that because we are now in a COVID situation, we're really looking at a distributed workforce. And so when you look at our graph or our picture that I've just shown here, what we're trying to depict here is that the blobs are really teams, and these teams are sort of self-constructing. They are autonomous, because we've gone from in many ways and from a centralist thing to saying that, well, we now need to disperse, so we don't have a big office block where we can all congregate. We almost all have to work from work from home now, but we still need to stay connected. And how are we connected? Well, we connected as a company. So one of these blobs could be a company, it could be a government department that has certain things. It could be a household, it could be anything. But what we're trying to get to is that these blobs need to stay interconnected. And the mechanism to stay interconnected, and the mechanism for even the blob to stay together, and that's why this is all lines of different forms and shapes. The way for these blobs to stay connected is through trust. And it was interesting off the poll that competence got, I think, 6%. And Covey starts with competence, as you pointed out. He says that trust is equal parts competence and character. And so when you are in a distributed organization, you know, the Marines has this thing where they say that when you are cut off from your unit, you know, let's say you're dropping in behind enemy lines and you have to make war, and you're in a war and you get cut from your enemy lines, it is the responsibility of that unit or that person to do as much damage as possible for as long as possible, with as little resources as is extended to. And that speaks to competence, because you're trained for war and you go and you do war until told otherwise. And so there's a bit of that. I cannot trust a team, where I know that the competence level is too low. So to me, it's a very simple part of the equation. There has to be competence to deliver on your task, and your task could be, like you mentioned, you can't trust. You mentioned your gardener. You can't trust your gardener if he's a builder to do gardening, right? So there has to be competence in the work that's at hand for you to extend your trust, else you're foolish. But I think what was interesting from our poll is most of our audience has gone for the character traits, and that's equally important. So
and I wonder if many of us, if we're in sort of financial services, IT, fintech, consulting, I wonder if a lot of us are surrounded, mostly surrounded by competence, and whether it's almost something that's assumed, and therefore, we take it for granted. But yeah, certainly an interesting result. But yeah, please share around your thoughts around the character piece.
Yeah, character to me is just. We had the word integrity. Integrity speaks of an internal constitution and an outward expression of that. In other words, to me, character is a consistent execution of that internal constitution. It's a consistency that comes with being very true to self. You can act consistently for a while if it's not in line with, because you can fake it. You can parrot it, but in the end, what shines through is the internal constitution. It is who you are. It's identity. That's why in our firm we speak a lot about identity, because I believe that the optimal functioning of any sort of group of people is in the optimal functioning of self first, and that has to come from an internal constitution. And so character starts with that. That then gives you, consistency over time. It gives you, under all sorts of pressure, the ability to remain, truthful and noble and just generally a good guy. That's generally what we want, right? We want someone who's consistent under all sorts of pressure, and I think that this is a good definition for the current times that we're in, because we're all under pressure. We're all under a different kind of pressure, and we have to remain, and our character it's being tested. So I think for me, character is also like, it's like what you do with the responsibility that you've been given, so that's almost a direct result of character, and it sort of shows character immediately.
Like you say, it's both an internal conviction, but it manifests outwardly in actions as well. I think it's Adam Grant, who's a famous American industrial psychologist, who said, also speaks about competence, and he breaks down character into sort of integrity and benevolence. Integrity, that you have a strong personal moral code and you act on that consistently, and then the benevolence, which speaks to the good intent. Your intentions can be trusted. You're acting in good faith. And
Yeah.
no, I love that. Thanks, Andries.
Interesting. Our poll also picked up on that. 30% of people saying that character or trust is in benevolence. So it's in wanting to do good. People trust people that are generally interested in the welfare of others, genuinely interested. Yes. Empathy, integrity. So people trust that a lot easier, but it has to be weighed with competence, of course. Yeah. So interesting point. I'd like to move on. I'm wary of time, but we also need to talk about currency. And what we wanted to say, and especially with the markets moving as it is at the moment, currency is very interesting. And it's very difficult to express an objective valuation method, which is what a currency is. A currency is only trying to express what people are exchanging. When people exchange goods and services, the currency is the objective measure to sort of weigh what it is. If you had a goat and I had 14 chickens, I could give you my 14 chickens for the goat, or we could all just agree to settle in rand. That would be an objective measure for the transaction. And so when we look at currency, it's saying that currency really is not it's not a piece of paper. It's an objective mechanism to say, when we've transacted, when we've exchanged trust, when you trust me to deliver something and I trust you to deliver something in return, then there has to be an objective measure how to then, conclude that transaction essentially. And so when we look at currency at the moment, we're saying that, but hang on, currencies are changing. There's a lot of measures that are changing. And in fact, the marketplace for the proposition, and this is interesting, but the marketplace for the proposition is changing. It's very easy to say that, we don't want things centralized. We want distributed mechanisms and we want distributed technology, and technology is distributing people, as you mentioned in the briefing, earlier. We've already, pre-COVID, we've already become a more distributed society. Because of technology, we can have interaction and we can have communication under all circumstances at all hours of the day. And, I think we've all been exposed to that, phone going off in the middle of the night with messages from the office or whatever. But under all conditions, under all circumstances, we are able to essentially connect. And connect means that there's a form of economy going. There's a form of value being exchanged. And so there has to be an objective way to define what that is. And here's the rub. When you are in a distributed organization, there's a lot less room for your currency to be unknown. In other words, for your value proposition to be unknown. In the old days, you could sit in a big office somewhere and you could lock your door, close your door, and people would say, oh, that department, they sort of know what they're doing. These days, with integrated work, with people actually executing on contracts all the time between one another, with teams executing on contracts with organizations, that's what distributed work means. No way for hiding. And I guess that the reason we ask the question, how much are you worth, is there's no place to hide anymore. You've got to answer this question for yourself, because there's a real currency in the workplace at the moment. Uber drivers know this best, as you mentioned earlier. They're getting rated all the time. They have a currency. And if they have a bad rating, they're not getting. The workplace is moving towards that, and COVID is accelerating it. So I guess the point is, there is an objective currency. It's rand, dollars. It doesn't matter. There's an objective way of looking what your value proposition is. Yes. Anyway, thoughts on that?
Yeah. Oh, I wish we had 3 hours, Andries. I mean, I'm loving listening to your reflections, and I think that is the question. We spoke about transparency, being one of the principles that underpin distributed ledger technology, of which blockchain is an example of. Another one of those underlying principles is peer-to-peer exchange. And with Uber and with Airbnb, we're seeing peer-to-peer review, right? And we're seeing the real estate and the hospitality industry and the taxi and transport industry being decentralized. But that's enabled by trust because of the reviewing system. We recently put our house on Airbnb, and my dad couldn't understand how we could trust strangers to come in living in our house. But I'm saying they've been reviewed. I can trust them, 40 people rated them. The average score is 4.95. And I guess then I wonder if it's a matter of time before we have those mechanisms in the work environment as well. And for me, the question is, whenever you've had an interaction with someone at work, or you've participated in a meeting, or you have been involved in a project, right? If the other people involved had to give you a 5-star rating immediately after that meeting, what would that 5-star rating be? And over time, what is your average? What is the average rating? You know, that comes back to the feedback that us millennials and Gen Z guys so badly crave. But we're empowered, you know, to what that rating will be by how we show up and how we build trust every day. And so I think it's about, it goes two ways, right? There's this question about, do you take a risk and entrust someone with something? And so trust is given in that sense. You know, you take a risk and then you see how they do, or does trust first need to be earned and they need to build up this track record? But I think both happens at the same time. You know, you're taking a small risk, someone's proving themselves, you're taking a bigger risk, they're proving themselves, etc. So it goes both ways. But I think the thing is that, you know, the extent to which we are trustworthy, you know, the strength, the value of our currency, if you will, the rating we're getting from our peers, will determine the significance of what we are entrusted with, right? And so that's what becomes important. It's about that awareness of what I say, what I believe, what I do, how that is building or breaking down trust, because that determines my currency and the flow of currency, in a sense, with peers in my network.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's becoming that. It's a brave new world out there. Albert, we've got 10 minutes. Are we going to go to Q&A or what? How does this work?
Yes, Andries. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions that came through, and I think we've got some time to do that. Some relevant questions. I've been just loving your session. So you can open up the Q&A box on your side. I'm going to go to the question. It's right to the bottom that came through from Louis Keane. Actually, first the second last one I'm going to ask you, because I think it continues on the topic that you've been discussing now, coming from Richard. And it's for both of you, Andries and Stefan. In your view, in terms of what has happened with lockdown and the negative impact on the economy and potential negative impact on consumers' wealth, will consumers punish government by moving to decentralized currencies? Some strong words of the punishment.
Yeah. Well, you know, maybe my disclaimer, and maybe to everyone listening at the moment, I'm now not speaking as the CEO of Andile. I would speak on my own behalf. If I had to say that, you know, as a business leader, it's very difficult in this time to reflect on the fact that, you know, we've had colleagues, we've had banks, we've had partners of ours who've had to, you know, we've made our own sacrifices already, but we've all sacrificed. You know, we've seen pay cuts in multiple industries. We've seen restaurant owners, you know, having to lay off staff. We've seen all sorts of stuff happening, of people actively trying to salvage their businesses and to make sure that we can, as a unit, as humanity almost, keep on doing what we're doing, and that is to, you know, through doing work, eat and have sustenance. You know, what we haven't seen is any cuts in government. We haven't seen government cutting anything at all. You know, they all getting their paychecks, they all still assured of their jobs, and they all getting bailouts, the ones that can't make it. And so if we don't punish them for this, I'd be very surprised. If the average person on the street thinks that this is fair, because frankly, they're not trustworthy, you know, in their handling of this, because they are not showing benevolence, which hurts themselves. In other words, it's not true benevolence. So they're saying we're giving you a handout on the one hand, but on the other hand, you know, we're still not going back to work. We're not cutting our own salary. So what am I saying? I'm saying that, Richard, to your question, if alternative currencies is seen as a way, you know, to get off the grid, In other words, you know, if you look at cryptocurrency specifically, where there's a huge deal of, let's say, anonymity, then, you know, people will use that. I think people will use that, maybe as a form of punishment. I don't know that that's necessary. And I think that, you know, but I think where we need to put pressure is on government to start saying, don't just give us handouts, which we have to pay for anyway, but show us that you're really in the game with us, you know, because that would be trustworthy behavior. Will we go to cryptos in terms of hiding wealth? I think people's been doing it anyway. I haven't seen a major uptick in the volumes of Bitcoin and so on. You know, so maybe, but I think what will happen, and this is something I'm seeing, that this distributed nature of work will allow for communities to sort of form very, very quickly. And they'll have their own ways of mitigating risk. They'll have their own ways of contracting with one another. They'll have their own ways of sort of raising issues, escalating issues, you know, and it won't be to the court. So definitely this whole new world will have a new set of rules. And if you don't like the rules, you don't play. And technology is enabling that. So that'll be interesting. So I don't just see people running to different currencies. I see people running to different ways of actually transacting, you know, which implies a new currency.
Yeah, I think there was, just as you were talking, there was a question that came through, and I think you addressed it here at the end, is how do you see the change in trust around currencies? And you addressed it here in your answer as well. Question, yeah, I'm going to ask this for you, Stefan. Andries referenced Malcolm Gladwell during his quote. And the question is, how would you perceive who the good guys are when you are no longer walking into the same room in these new ways of working we find ourselves in? I think where Andries spoke about trust, in the first 5 seconds, you can know if you trust someone, but you've got those senses. The way we're interacting now is we're losing a lot of those senses. For me, being an extrovert with all these video conferencing, it's tiring. And I've read some articles, and people say we used to get energy out of people in a room and the interaction. You can read body language. You just can't do that over our new way of working. So yeah, it's a relevant question. This, how do you, in this new way of working, how do you walk into a room? How do you do it differently? We've all had for 61 days these constant conference calls.
I think it's a great question, and I think you know, I actually derive great pleasure from this virtualization and remote working, because I thought, you know, dear micromanager, you can no longer manage the way that you used to, you know, and so that for me was great. We no longer can you sort of pop in and just watch over someone's shoulder. I think some people are still trying to do that and sending WhatsApps and emails and status reports all hours of the day. But I think the great thing that comes out of this is that we're no longer tracking hours and activity, but we're forced to more and more track deliverables and output. You know, so I don't actually care how many hours you work or when you worked, but did you deliver? Right, becomes the question. And I think that's the one way. Quality of output, quality of deliverables is in determining who the good guys are, even when we're physically distanced from each other and we're engaging virtually. But I think a mentor of mine is a clinical psychologist who worked he was an HR executive position in large organizations for a long time. He does executive coaching and training now, and he says, you know, in coaching conversations, they've experienced this phenomenon called the safety of the screen. And in some ways, in their coaching conversations, they're actually getting to issues quicker than before. And some people are experiencing a greater sense of safety. So I think we're still in the early stages of our comfort in working this way, but I think we can actually pick up on more than we give ourselves credit for, even on the screen and even working virtually and remotely. And so I think it's about just picking up on different nuances in that way. But then again, the shift from sort of activity and hours to output and quality deliverables.
Yeah. Andries, anything you want to add there?
No, I'd love to answer Paul's question that's just come through. So Paul's asked, what are my thoughts on the scoring system for people? And this scoring system was piloted in China, where everyone scores you, and this affects how eligible you are for certain mortgages and homes and so on. And Paul, a great question, because what we're really talking about here is centrist versus distributed. This is almost the age-old debate of let's say, socialism versus liberalism, where in liberalism you have self-forming entities, and so anything coming out of China I'd be wary of, because it's extremely centrist, it's extremely planned, so, but if it is around the mechanism to establish mechanisms where we can score one another within the context of a community which is self-formative, which like Uber is a good example. If you don't want to use Uber, then you can get one of the other apps. But if you're on Uber, if you're a driver, then you better play to the rules. And then there's a social sort of a network which scores you. And next time, maybe your car is going to be cleaner, and you're going to drive slower and more accurately. And that's good for everyone. So I'm very much pro to this. I'm very pro in terms of extending credit, as to your question, because when you have a eligibility for mortgages, that relates to credit worthiness. And credit worthiness certainly isn't just the ability for you to pay your bills. It's a lot more than that. And I think that if you have a scoring system which can integrate a lot more factors into something like that, it'd be very interesting. As long as it's not controlled by a centrist party, you can actually then sort of fudge the data, game the game, as it were.
Yeah. We still have time for some more questions. If there's anything coming through, please submit it. Yeah, Stefan, anything you want to add to what Andries answered there? On your side?
No, I agree with, I'll just agree with him.
I've worked with Andries for a very long time, and sometimes I just give the same answer. Yeah, I'll just agree with that.
My favorite moment is not agreeing with Andries, because then we have wonderful philosophical debates. But in that case, I have to agree.
Please don't agree. We've got questions here by CJ Pretorius. I think they're all sort of related to the same topic, which is, where does money come from? This is the ultimate source. If the world stops and books are drawn up, who owes who? Where does the IMF and the world come? The West owes the East, and the East going to own the world. Is the East going to own the world? Very, very interesting question. So CJ Pretorius, I think the short answer to that is, COVID is also exposing a massive war on currency that is going on at the moment. And this war is essentially between the traditional banking system and what is now established by the East. And interestingly, you may think that I'm a bit schizophrenic, but the Chinese are developing a distributed system of payments through the blockchain at the moment, which is up directly against what the West has through the SWIFT network. Now, there's a saying that says that one man's liberation fighter is another man's terrorist. And I am certainly against terrorism and any form of violence, certainly political violence. But I think that all forms of violence, I didn't just put a caveat on that. I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that when you look at the traditional Western payment system, it's very interesting, because it is governed through the SWIFT network. Everything essentially clears through New York. And what's been happening since Twin Towers, since 2001, is that the US have sort of started making certain activities terrorist activities, and they've governed the world financial system based on that, in the name of terrorism, in the name of the war on terror. Now, that is ironic, because frankly, as a market that should be operating freely, this sort of behavior has been intrusive. And so there's a real appetite in the world to go after something that is a distributed payment mechanism, which is clear of any sort of centralist interference. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with the US doctrine. That's not the point. The point is that system is old. It was developed in the 1970s, and it is centrist. It is controllable, it's influenceable, and it's being influenced. The new modern mechanism, which is now unfortunately being front-run by the Chinese, it should be us, right, is distributed. And so why is this important? Because when you look at your questions, it revolves around what is the reserve currency. Okay, so what is the currency in which the world sort of values everything from a fundamental perspective. And at that stage, because of the mechanism, it is the US dollar. That mechanism was established in the Second World War and in Bretton Woods following, okay? So what's happening at the moment? It's changing. And COVID is pushing the change, actually, because people are getting to work interconnected in a different way, and they want more transparency. They want, and also they want more autonomy. They want choice, right? And so it's a great question. I would say this: if the books are drawn up at the moment, the West still leads the race, but not for long.
Thanks, thanks for that, Andries. Sure, we've run out of time. It's been a brilliant session. I've loved it, Stefan, Andries. Thank you very much. Andries, you left us there on a bit of a high. I think there's definitely going to be some conversation, but that is the idea of Axiom. Axiom is a basis where we talk about topics, but it's a basis where we can have more conversation and more debates after this. So we welcome your thoughts, we welcome your opinions. You can email us at axiom@untilesolutions.com if you've got any questions, if you want to engage with any of the panelists, or if you have suggestions for future topics, we would love to talk to you. Before we go, Stefan, Andries, Stefan from you, then still by, before you not allowed to go onto the beach, any closing thoughts there from you?
I just want to say thank you, Albert. I have huge respect for Andries and for the team at Andile, and it's a privilege for me to be part of this conversation. And I realize, you know, it feels a bit presumptuous to talk about a subject like trust. It's a weighty subject, and we're obviously all on a journey, you know, in our own trustworthiness and how we're managing that. I would leave the audience with this question, you know, that I'm thinking about is what we referred to earlier, that the extent to which you're trustworthy will determine the significance of what you're entrusted with. And so your trustworthiness, our trustworthiness is tested every day. There are significant moments where that's tested disproportionately. But let's think about that, reflect on ourselves. We're quick to say, you know, someone else doesn't trust me. But just to think personally, how am I proving my own trustworthiness so that I can be entrusted those significant things? But it's great. Yeah, many provoking comments, questions, thoughts. I'm going to be thinking about this for a long while. Would love to hear from anyone following the webinar as well. Yeah, thanks, Albert.
Thanks. Andries, anything from you? Closing.
No, I have nothing to add. I think that was a great summation. Thank you, Stefan.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Stefan. Andries, that is, it's been brilliant. So, yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today. Next session coming up is of Andile Curtin. Andile is an expert in the industry. He's been in the industry for working in the capital markets and treasury space. He's a part of the director on SAIFM, and he's conducted over the past 20 years or so more than 100 ACI conferences or events, and he's going to be talking to us on the evolution of fixed income markets in Africa on the 10th of June. And then towards the end of June, one of our in-house architects, Bernard Boussy, is just going to be talking around blockchain and breaking it down for each one of us. Going to be, again, a panel discussion. So, yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We'll send through communications of recording and next sessions, but please feel free to reach out to us at axiom@untilesolutions.com. We encourage discussion, we encourage debate. Have a great day, stay warm, stay safe, and when we get there, enjoy level 3. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers, bye-bye.